Hello, hello. Hello, everyone. We're gonna get started. We want to make sure that everyone is out of here on time. Thank you very much for coming to our second public forum of the spring season of the UA debate series. Yeah, woo, indeed. Yeah, we can all applaud for that. It's great. Thank you guys for coming out. A few quick notes. We began this entire program just last fall, and as you can see, it's growing and growing exponentially. I want to give a very, very big thank you to our marketing team, especially because that's why most of you are sitting down right now, because you heard about this from them. So thank you so much. And thank you to our interns in general. And I want to say this, if any of their teachers are here, if you could do me a favor and fail them so they can't graduate, so I could just have them as the interns for the next few years, that would be really fantastic and a great favor to me. So thank you. So a couple things. I want to make sure that everyone's aware of our events that are coming up. On April 9th, we have a debate over college accessibility and whether or not college should be free for community college and the philosophy behind that. We want to make sure that we have a good debate over that. On April 23rd, we're going to have a double debate about prison rehabilitation. We're going to be talking about whether or not prisoners should be able to have access to a college education. We're going to be talking about the prison industrial complex. So it'll be certainly an interesting debate for everyone to come to. And certainly, we want to announce in the fall, in November, we are going to be hosting the statewide tournament called the Regents Cup, where ASU and NAU will be coming down here to compete against the students of the U of A. And we are actually right now accepting applications for anyone who wants to be involved in that. So if you're interested in public speaking or debate, we're going to be hosting a tournament, the subject of which is campus free speech. So if anybody's interested, absolutely, you can contact me and come and talk to me afterwards, and that would be wonderful. So a few more things that I want to make sure that you guys are clear on for tonight. So first of all, our voting system. You were handed cards when you came inside. We want to make sure that we have as accurate a voting system as possible. And the way that this works is it's Oxford-style debate, which means everyone's going to vote at the beginning, and everyone's going to vote at the end. And the winners of this debate are not who ends up getting the most votes, but who ends up swaying the audience the most from the beginning to the end. So it's more about convincing people and changing minds than it is about scoring initial points. So please make sure that you know exactly how to vote. The green note cards that are in front of you are for the resolution, the affirmative side. The yellow cards are if you're undecided or neutral or in the middle or you don't really know a whole lot about the topic. And the pink cards are for against or negative if you're against the resolution. And the resolution is behind me as worded. And the voting will be taking place prior to listening to all of the speakers. But after, we have our wonderful introduction by our guest speaker, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute. I do want to say it's great that we have a guest speaker to introduce everything tonight. Because of all of the topics we've done, I am more or less illiterate on this topic. So most of my questions as a moderator are going to be, explain that to me again like I'm a 5-year-old, because I don't know a whole lot about this, and our 4 debaters are far more well-read on this particular issue than I am. So I'm excited to hear what they have to say. You also have raffle tickets in front of you. If you didn't get a raffle ticket, you might want to grab one. We're going to be holding a raffle, and we'll be giving away gift cards at the end. But we're going to be giving away gift cards at the very, very end. Please note, we will be announcing the winner of the debate before you leave tonight. And as we're calculating the actual tally of the vote, that's when we'll start to look through all of the raffle tickets. And we're going to call out who's the winner of the raffle after we announce the winner of the debate. So if you want a free gift card, you might want to stick around to find out who won the debate tonight. That said, without further ado, I'd like to call up Dr. Martha Whitaker, who is professor of practice in the hydrology department. She earned her PhD in hydrology from the University of Arizona. And she is the Director of Graduate Studies for Hydrology Programs right here, and we want to give her a big round of applause, and she's going to give you a quick primer on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to say, first of all, this is really exciting to be here. I haven't taken part in a debate before, never was part of a debate team. But I love this idea, and I love the fact that if you don't know a whole lot about water rights and about water privatization and the pros and cons of it, I bet you guys know more than I do about it because I'm trained scientifically, but I can tell you a little bit about it. I wanted to say thank you to Jenny, who invited me. I met Jenny in a class that I teach. It's a hydrology gen ed, tier 2 gen ed, and it's about Arizona water issues. And in that class, I talk about some basic water rights, things like water, a little bit about water privatization, about whether water is a human right, things like that. So let's just go right on into the primer. When I hear the phrase water privatization, it can mean a number of things, but I'm trying to contextualize it in terms of what this prompt is. And what I understand that to mean is that the private sector is participating in the distribution and provision of potable or drinkable water to the public. So to residences, to an industry, and to commercial entities. And they also take care of sewage treatment. So they give you the clean water and they take the nasty stuff away and clean it up. So that's what they do. And they're generally nonprofits. So public water providers like Tucson Water tend to be nonprofit entities, and they are managed by local or state governments. In our case, Tucson Water is managed by the city of Tucson, so it's a government entity. And their rates, the water rates, how much you pay, are set by a governing board. So there are a couple pros and cons to this. I try, when I teach the class, I try not to put forth any particular preference by myself as an instructor. So one of the pros of having a public water provider is that they are nonprofit. Their objective is to provide a public service, okay? So that is their objectives, that's their mission. And that's kind of cool. So the con, though, is that those lower rates that they provide might not really reflect that water is a scarce resource, especially in a city like the desert, or a city like this, a region like the desert, and a city like Tucson. So that's something to really think about and consider. So I wanted to do just a really quick exercise. It won't go on very long, I promise. But I see a number of people have, water bottles that they fill up with water and then water bottles that they drink. And I do this little exercise to underscore issues of bottled water, but it also has to do with how cheap water is. If you were to drink 8 8-ounce glasses of water per day, like you're supposed to, the health people say do that, and you were to drink 8 8-ounce glasses of tap water, how much do you think it would cost if you drank 8 8-ounce glasses of tap water every day of the year? Someone call out a number. 0? Okay, it's 0. What else? Couple of cents. Any others? $50? Okay, so we've got anything from 0 to $50, which is really much lower than I thought that people would say. How much do you think it would cost if you were to buy either Fiji water or Smart Water and drink that number of, the same amount of water every day for a year? How much do you think that costs? How much? It's actually, so here's the range. If you drink tap water, I did the calculation, it costs 29 cents a year to drink the water, which is essentially free. It's just, change that you find on the ground. But if you were to drink bottled water like Fiji or Smart Water, that's on the order of $2,000 to $3,000 a year. Or if you were to buy, other water, it's, anywhere from a couple $100 a year, something like that. But the fact that Tucson water, tap water, and it's not unusual that it's that cheap, is only 29 cents a year, that speaks to this ideology of water being a human right, and Tucson Water providing a public service. Now, it is possible for them to address that, and then at the same time recognize that water is a scarce resource by providing a tiered rate structure. So if you're only using a little bit of water just to clean and to drink, you're not going to be paying a whole lot. It's basically going to be essentially very nominal fee, very free. And that cheapness is going to be subsidized by people who use a heck of a lot of water, who have great big lawns and take 45-minute showers and have a swimming pool, because they're going to be paying a much higher rate, and each tier that you go up in terms of how much you use goes up higher and higher. So it's maybe $1 per unit of water, and then it's $2.50, then it's $4, then it's $5, and so on. So it goes up pretty quickly if you use a lot of water. Okay, so that was an exercise there. So when we're talking about private water providers, they tend to be for-profit systems, and they're managed by investors and stakeholders. And even though their rates are monitored by a state's public commission, the private systems aren't necessarily subject to that regulating board for their rates. So there's pros and cons to this as well. The pro is that if you treat water as a commodity and not just as something that's essentially free, and I mean, imagine if you paid for beer or water or milk as just for the delivery costs, and you didn't actually pay for it as a commodity. That's what we're doing for water. But if we actually treat it as an economic commodity, if it's priced accordingly, that could lead people to really think about how they're using water, and then maybe can be treated as the scarce resource that it is, especially in the desert. The con is, the bottom line for private corporations is profit. And the question a lot of critics ask is, wow, our corner is going to be cut just to save money and to turn a profit for shareholders? So those are the kinds of questions you tend to need to ask. And one more thing I wanted to say is I'm under the understanding that the difference between public and private water providers can sometimes be blurred, because there's a thing where there's a public-private partnership. And that's above my pay grade because I'm trained scientifically. But I wanted to let you guys know that that's a thing, and I am looking forward to hearing what both parties have to say on this card.
Turn it off. Thank you very much, Dr. Whitaker. All right, so the way the voting will work is we have Taylor, Lexi, and Jaden will be coming to collect your cards. You could pass them to the aisle for your initial vote. On this resolution, distribution of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government. Vote yes or no or undecided on that resolution. Distribution of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government. Just to let you know how the whole entire night is going to work, we'll go in 3 rounds. I am your host and moderator and executive director of the UA Debate Series, Ted McLoof. What we'll be doing is this. The opening round will consist of 7-minute opening statements from either side. We'll first hear from the affirmative and then hear from the negative. After that, we'll hear our second round, where we'll get cross-examination. We'll hear questions and answers, and we'll allow our debaters to address each other and to answer each other's questions. And finally, we'll have our closing statements, which will be 6 minutes each from either side, finding out exactly what it is that they need to say. And we'll have a Q&A round in the second round, so please have your questions ready, and we'll certainly allow our debaters to answer them. So that said, opening up the debate on this resolution, distribution of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government. Opening up the debate on the affirmative side of the resolution, we have Kayla.
All right, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, perfect. All right, hello everyone. I just kind of wanted to thank you all for being here for our debate about water distribution. So today we're kind of debating whether the distribution and infrastructure of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government. Now you may be wondering, why are you here today? The water still comes out of your sink, and your hydro flask is full, and it's been cold for the past 3 days, not to brag or anything. So why then are you here today? You may want some more information on the way our water systems work, because they're incredibly confusing and there's not a lot of data out there for everybody to see, and they don't promote it in the news very often. And I know that I wanted to know more about it too. Before this debate, I had no idea the huge extent of the mismanagement of our water resources by federal, state, and local government. Currently, our water system is a hodgepodge of federal, state, and local ownership in which the federal government neglects to fix water infrastructure and ensure our water systems are safe efficient, and affordable, all the while state and local governments are defaulting on their current distribution plants that allocate water due to the incredibly low and unsustainable cost of water and their mismanagement of it. These local and state governments have made a significant shift to contracting in water distribution companies to fix the problems the federal government refuses to fix and they cannot afford to fix. Now imagine a world in which these companies were contracted by state and local governments with oversight from the EPA to fix the many problems our current water system has. This is the world my partner Vincent and I will show you, in contrast to the ever-worsening system we're dealing with in this era today. In the rest of the speech, I'll explain to you all why Vincent and I came to the conclusion that water distribution rights should be transferred to private companies to save our water systems from imminent and quick collapse. First, I'd like to tell you about the economic reasons to vote for our side, the side of privatization for this debate. First and foremost, I'd like to discuss a misinformation about pricing that the opposition will likely try to tell you. They will tell you that prices will have to increase for companies to meet corporate bottom lines, but this isn't the case. Mildred Warner, a professor of city and regional planning at Cornell University, looked at studies conducted from 1965 to 2009 and found no differences in cost between privately controlled and publicly controlled systems. In some cases, water rates needed to be raised slightly, but it isn't because corporate America is trying to screw you out of a dollar. It's all about improving the quality of your water, reducing waste, and preventing contaminants from entering our water systems. Pipes in the U.S. are entering what the American Water Works Association calls the replacement era, meaning that many pipes are nearing or have already passed their retirement dates, and they need to be replaced. We're talking about 1.2 million miles of pipes across the United States that will cost the U.S. government over $1 trillion to replace over a span of 2 decades. This $1 trillion is simply to replace, not to innovate or to modernize, but simply to swap one bad pipe for another pipe that will fail within 70 years. Not to mention the compounded cost when those pipes break and are hastily and improperly fixed. According to the EPA, about 24,000 water mains break every year in the country, sucking $2.6 billion down the drain. Then we have our aging sewer structures, which borrow sewer technology from the Roman era and spit billions of raw sewage into local surface waters. In order to modernize, innovate, and fix our drastically decaying water system, it would cost the U.S. government over $1 trillion, money that it simply doesn't have and it hasn't made an effort to reallocate. Nearly enough funding to be able to tackle all the costs. The U.S. government also has many other important issues to tackle that when water issues arise, such as issues in Flint, Michigan, where there hasn't been clean water in around 1,470 days, the government ignores them, and celebrities like Jaden Smith have to step in with their nonprofits to make a change. With so much that needs to be changed and no motivation or money from the government to do it, we turn to privatization. These for-profit companies have time, manpower, money, and the will to do this. Since water is their product, they're incentivized to make it safer, more efficient, and more innovative. With competition between water companies comes innovation, which will improve the system to maximize profit and sustainability. This leads into my second major benefit of privatization, which is efficiency. We can look at a current example in Britain where water is largely privatized. They had similar issues to those that we are facing in the United States, and since privatization, they've solved many of those issues regarding water waste, inefficiency, and cost. Government is historically inefficient. It has been acknowledged by both sides of the aisle that water infrastructure is deteriorating, but yet no solution has been reached. And instead, the exact opposite has been done, as funding for water infrastructure has gone down more and more every year, crippling our water structure even further. Lastly, privatization encourages water companies to become more environmentally conscious. Since water is their product, these companies will do everything in their power to ensure the sources that they get water from are clean and protected. These companies are incentivized to clean trash and oil to make their water sources cleaner. These companies also perform a task called desalination, which essentially removes the salt from salt water. This means that these companies will use ocean as a water resource and would be incentivized to clean trash out of the ocean and to prevent the dumping of pollutants into the ocean, to make the desalination process easier and to ensure that their source of water is safe and clean, which in turn benefits the environment greatly. We already see local and state governments handing over water distribution rights to private companies because so many of these city and state governments don't have the funding to fix the infrastructure and distribution problems that the federal government isn't willing to fix. These cities and states operate with a price ceiling where water cannot exceed a certain price. This makes water accessible and ensures that a private company doesn't become abusive with its practices. Water rights being turned over to private companies doesn't mean that they will operate as an unregulated monopoly. These companies are and will continue to be highly regulated by the EPA. These companies are chartered by state and local governments whom they have contracts with to hold them accountable. For example, in Camden, New Jersey, they entered into a 20-year contract with Suez to operate and maintain the city's water systems. But the city terminated the contract a few years later after finding it badly mismanaged Camden's water resources. In February earlier this year, American Water took over management of the city's water systems for a 10-year contract. Lured by incentives, the company is also luring its headquarters to Camden, creating many economic benefits for the city itself. They were able to hold a company accountable by being able to change contracts. Since federal, state, and local governments will be alleviated of the cost to regulate water infrastructure and distribution, they will be able to allocate even more money for those who can't afford water in the form of water stamps or by helping people pay their water bills. Programs such as these are already in place and can be given even more funding as a result of these cities being alleviated of the cost. In conclusion, federal government does not have the funds and resources to fix our water systems and has shown no initiative whatsoever. State and local governments already do not have enough resources or funds to fix our water systems, and many have already made the switch to privatization due to a further lack of funding from the federal government. All in all, private companies have the resources, the money, the time, the manpower, and the will to fix our deteriorating water system in an efficient, economic, and environmentally conscious way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caleb. And opening up the debate and speaking for 7 minutes on the negative side of the resolution that distribution of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government, we have Juan Torres.
This thing's really low. So first, I would just like to thank everybody for coming in and joining us today to talk about private and public water systems. Evidently, this might seem like a dry topic, but in actuality, this is something really important because we are on the brink of water being one of the most scarcest resources we have. People have identified water as the next oil crisis that will be a worldwide crisis, and it is evidently leading to the deaths of marginalized peoples worldwide. And this is largely due also to mainly privatization of water trends that have been recent in the years. So first, I would like to address what water privatization means. Privatizing water includes outsourcing services such as the distribution of water from the source to where it needs to get to. So basically getting from the source to the tap at your house. Next, private companies, they do enter contracts with certain municipalities in order to build, maintain, and operate certain water systems in order to fix these systems because local economies are unable to. Now, the reason why these local municipalities are unable to invest in these water systems is due to large mismanagement in recent years. In the past decades, local officials have been very irresponsible with the way that they manage water resources and getting water to their people. They do this not just by, although it sounds odd, but they do this also by making water so cheap, by making water so easily accessible for people, because then people see it as something that, I can use my water hose for hours and it won't make a difference because either way my water bill is going to be roughly the same. And this incentivizes people to actually conserve water, which is a main issue that we will be facing in the near future. Privatization is also when these local governments give complete ownership to private companies. Right now, the two largest private companies in the U.S. that allocate distribution of water is Suez, which is a French company, and also two companies that cooperate that are German companies. And all these companies are just naturally incentivized to make profits for their shareholders. People invest money in these private companies to fix these systems, when in actuality what they're trying to get to is they're trying to get more money in their pockets. And this is simply just part of America's capitalist society that has been historically proven to discriminate against non-whites, which will continue to happen if we continue going into this privatization trend. Privatization of water itself will will simply take away what water is to, what water means to people, not just in how they use it, but into people that water is a part greatly of their identity, is a part greatly of their life. There's a lot of, so a large part of the agricultural system in the U.S., for example, gets federally subsidized water prices when they get water from state and local governments. So what will happen to these agricultural plants once we move this over to privatization? Obviously, private companies will see all these companies using so much water, and they're just going to be seeing more profits for them. No boss whatsoever that runs these private companies will ever want somebody to come in and be like, hey, boss, guess what? Our sales just went down 25%. People are using less water. That's just not going to happen. People and private companies don't want to hear that. Private companies are naturally incentivized to just make profit off the people. Now, mere commercials and aspirational billboards from these private companies aren't enough to really push the crisis that we're facing currently, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. And we've seen this from various companies, like, for example, Microsoft is starting to introduce this technology to use agricultural methods to water even more plants to increase agricultural produce. Surprisingly, these methods were actually quite similar to indigenous methods that were used for centuries, long before the colonial era. And private companies rely on this, private companies rely on this ability to pay model for their distribution. Private companies will immediately cut off somebody's water if they're not paying. Private companies have no incentive to keep water going to somebody who's not able to pay. However, the government has the actual resources to be able to identify people that are financially unstable, people that have been completely disabled to be able to meet these resources, to be able to meet this financial burden of getting water to their homes. And when we move to private companies are first going to these neighborhoods that can actually afford their prices. Private companies have no incentive to actually go to neighborhoods that can't afford their prices. And in essence, what we're getting at is to avoid these violations, the government needs to introduce a new method to bring more transparency into water rights in general, and into people's individual rights to be able to have a source of water, not just simply for consumption, but also for sanitation purposes. That's all I got.
Thank you, Juan. And to remind everyone where we are, we're now at the end of round one. We're going to get into round two, where our debaters are going to be able to address each other and answer each other's questions and answer your questions. But just as a quick recap so that everyone knows where we are, right now we have the affirmative team suggesting that government is particularly disorganized and that our system actually can't really function under the government. They tried to dispel certain myths about how it is that companies about how it is the companies are going to work. They make the proposal that full privatization is the way to go because the government is so mismanaged right now. They point out that a lot of the pricing that's going to happen under a private model is out of necessity rather than greed. They point out that the government ignores cities that are in need, and they point out Flint, Michigan as a particular example of this. They point out that the profit motive is exactly what's going to lead to more efficiency. And on that same note, they point to the idea that because clean water is the product, they'll be incentivized to make sure that the water is as clean as possible. The negative side, responding to those points by pointing out that private companies will actually be incentivized only for profit and not necessarily for the greater good. They aren't necessarily interested in safety. They're only interested in money, and they will choose money when they have to make that decision. They point out that privatization traditionally discriminates against minority citizens, and they also point out that private companies obviously will, in their mind, discriminate against poorer Americans and cut off their resources. So I want to just talk, first of all, to the side on the negative side of this, and I want to hear your response, because I heard you guys mention both minority citizens and poorer Americans, and you're talking about how it is that discrimination usually comes from the private sector. So I want to hear why it is that, how it is that minority citizens would be affected by this, and why it is that you think that discrimination exists.
Why they would be discriminated by?
Why and how minority citizens would be particularly affected by a privatization model.
Well, I mean, historically, minority citizens have been subject to various social, political, and economic legislation that has led to us not being as far economically as whites. And
the way that they would be particularly hurt by privatized water is that the rates are going to go up, and so it's going to be less accessible. And we see, especially in areas where a lot of people move out because there's a low quality of life. If we see a shift in the population, that raises the rates in order to cover the high fixed costs for the local or state water systems there. And so low-income areas aren't able to cover that gap when private companies come in.
Okay, so let's hear a response from the affirmative team, because I didn't hear this necessarily be addressed in the opening.
I kind of also have a question for the negative. I was going to ask you guys, haven't minorities been subject to incredible discrimination from the government? And I kind of have an example that pertains to water rights, especially right here in our own backyard in Tucson. There was a period some odd 50, 60 years ago when the Tucson government built a bunch of houses in a low-income neighborhood, and a lot of Mexican immigrants moved into this neighborhood. And the Tucson government was aware that there were a ton of contaminants in the water, that there were a ton of issues with the piping that was there, that they set it up really fast, and then they lied to all of these people that moved in and told them that they would have safe water, when in actuality they didn't, and all these people got all these autoimmune diseases, a ton of other bad things happened to them, and they begged the government, hey, there's something in the water, and the government ignored them, told them they were lying, conducted studies, found out that there was stuff in the water, and then continually did nothing. So how do you guys prevent the government, which has historically been incredibly racist, from doing something like that again?
Well, the way that the government would address that is that they would make it a lot more easy for people to actually get more involved in their water resource in general. When you get your water bill, how about they send you an actual letter, like declaring, hey, this is like some current issues that we're noticing with water. Hey, we're thinking about moving to this company. They get people involved, people that are actually paying for these water resources. They get them more involved, and then that information becomes more transparent. Because a lot of these state governments, what they have is they have legislation that says that local governments can go ahead and move all their public ownership rights to private companies without even hinting to the public of what they're doing.
Can I ask a question to them? Sure. Kayla, you said that there's a drastic deficit in the annual funding that the government gives in order to maintain our water facilities, and that's why they're kind of in the state of disrepair that they're in. We agree with that, so obviously you're arguing for the private side. How would privatization help to improve those facilities efficiently in comparison to more federal funding or more taxpayer money being allocated?
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up. So what's important to understand is that a lot of these private companies, like they brought up, like Juan brought up in his speech, they have like investors. But the difference is that when you have investors or other people backing this company, there's specific money going towards making these systems more efficient, and thus like to drive a profit, I guess you would say. Making systems more efficient in a privatized world with water is important, because having a broken pipe isn't going to generate any sort of funds for that private company, but instead increasing funds and having a more efficient system that lasts a lot longer is what is ultimately going to help like these private companies versus in the government, for example. What we've seen historically is that you have partisan divides on whether or not we should be having infrastructure spending. In fact, since the 1960s, we have seen a significant drop in infrastructure spending, specifically with water. That's because this is such a partisan issue when it shouldn't be. You take out the government, you get rid of the partisan issue, and you have private companies who are centered, who are built around the fact that this is their business. They need to provide efficient systems, otherwise they're not going to be existent to begin with.
Yeah, and then not to mention, especially with these broken pipes and other things like that, companies wouldn't want, their profits going down the drain, literally. And especially with gallons of raw sewage being spewed into local surface waters, the government hasn't been fixing them. It hasn't been fixing it. It's polluting its own waterways. Private companies would want to protect those waterways, and it's definitely more environmentally conscious, especially because there's none of these broken pipes. There's no raw sewage going into our water systems. It's conserving the water, and especially with the pricing being the way that it is, people will be more incentivized to use less water and to be more conscious. This water right here next to me is essentially free. I could dump it on the floor right now and it wouldn't cost me anything, and I wouldn't think much of it. But with this model, it's more environmentally conscious, and it allows for the environment to not have this raw sewage being put into it and to not have their waterways being clogged up.
So you can respond. I have a question after that, though.
Okay, sure. So I feel like that's a little imaginary that under a private system that there's not going to be pipes breaking and we're not going to see the continual issues that we have, because as you pointed out, we're in the replacement area where there's 1.2 million miles of piping that's going to need to be replaced over the next 20 years, which will require over $1 trillion. And private investors aren't going to be incentivized to improve and put money in long-term improvements for our piping. They're profit driven. They're going to sell when it becomes inefficient or when the infrastructures fail to the extent that they're not going to make a profit anymore. As well as they're going to kick out a lot of the low skill workers that are there. So what happens in places like Stockton, California, or in various water service areas in Wisconsin, when private companies have come in and taken over, they hire the majority of the low skill workers and fill their places with high skill workers that get paid exponentially more and overall the same amount annually that the low skill workers did, but they don't actually put effort into improving the infrastructures long term.
So I think what's important to understand is that this whole entire replacement era has only just became relevant within the past decade or so. What's important to understand is that with any company really, you're thinking long term. Where's my company going to be in 50 years from now? Do I want it to be successful? Do I want it to be profitable? Business owners think in the long term, and that's what these private companies are going to be doing. You're not going to have this one company, private company, in charge of all the water distribution in America. You're going to have several different companies competing against one another under a private system, so that way they are able to offer better services than, let's say, company A provides better quality water than company B. That's important to understand, and right now, the whole replacement era only has become relevant within the past decade, and so that's why we haven't necessarily seen this improvement taking shape. But come let's say 5-10 years from now, when all those pipes do actually start flooding and bursting everywhere, there's going to have to be a replacement, and that's only through private companies.
So I just want to make a quick point in regards to, so they keep pushing this idea that they believe firmly that private companies will be incentivized to actually bring this innovation. Look at private companies, for example, in the car industry, in in our fossil fuel industry. None of these companies have made improvements into any of their infrastructures. Instead, they have kept it as is because it's cheaper for them. They cut corners, they make profits, and we still have these coal factories that are running with 35% efficiencies. We still have cars that are burning fuel with 25 to 30% efficiency, and it's evident that these private companies are definitely not incentivized to innovate. They're just incentivized to make money.
So let me ask a follow-up question, because I've only asked one so far, and we'll turn to the audience after this as well. So I'm hearing a lot, and obviously this is sort of in a larger respect, sort of just a debate about government and public versus private sector. I want to talk about this though. I'm hearing a lot of sort of discussion of the average citizen and how it is they're affected by this, as though they're sort of pawns in the game of either the government or the private entities. I want to have a quick conversation about what is the role of the actual citizens and which model actually gives more autonomy to the citizens themselves to sort of be incentivized or to change whatever system that they have. And I threw the first question to you guys, so I'll throw this one to you.
So I think it's important to understand that in the private system, citizens will be able to have more of a say. Because right now in government, there's a lot of different reasons why you vote for your candidate. You don't necessarily vote for them because they want to fix the pipes underneath us right now. That's not a major hot topic. So the government isn't necessarily accountable when it comes comes to things such as improvement. Versus a water company, if your water is off because of a broken pipe main, and this happens for like a week, or you've had dirty water for, I believe, hundreds of days, such as Flint, Michigan, the water company is going to be held accountable, and at that point, that's when the government, because there's company abuse, when we've seen abusive companies in the past, that's when the government steps in. But because under a privatized system, the customer is essentially in charge because the company wants their business, we're seeing that the consumer actually has more power in a privatized world than in the current status quo in a public system.
Well, they have more power to pay higher rates that go directly into the pockets of the people that are running the companies. But I don't really agree with your argument that it's going to give them better access to influence the operations of the company, because what we see with large corporations is citizens having very little ability to influence the sorts of decisions that they make nationwide. And whereas with the government, we do have the capacity to vote and to talk to our lawmakers and to try to advance an agenda to improve the way that things are being handled. And it's obvious that we need a significant increase in funding to improve the issues that we're currently seeing, but it's going to be much more feasible for that to happen through government programs as opposed to private equity that is not going to be consistent. And it's simply not plausible that private investors are going to be willing to put in the level of money required to replace the pipes compared to the government, because the money's a lot cheaper for the government to get.
And of course, you can say that the money is cheaper for the government, but the government doesn't. You can, of course, beg the government to do something for you, but it doesn't mean that it's obligated to do anything. You would hope that they would want to be fixing the water systems, that they would be wanting to help everyone to make sure that people in Flint, Michigan get their water, but the reality is it's not a hot button issue. A lot of you probably came here today not knowing what we were even going to be talking about, really, because it's not a big ticket issue. As we've seen historically, the government isn't incentivized to help you because they're not making a profit off the water. They're not turning a profit. They're not doing anything to the water. They're just giving it to you for basically pocket change. But with a private company, you are the customer. And as you've kind of heard within the business world, the customer is always right. So with these private companies, you're their customer. They have to listen to you. And as I showed with the example in Camden, New Jersey, when the companies were doing something that was incorrect and they mismanaged the water, the state and local governments kicked them out. And they're being regulated by the EPA, and they're being held accountable by these state and local governments which charter them. They're on these charters. The state holds them accountable on kind of a more micro level. So it's not just one big company who owns everything. It's state and local governments who charter out to these private companies who then have to give you your water. And I remember that, Juan, you kind of mentioned that people's water would get shut off because of private companies, but doesn't that already happen under the model with public and private? So regardless, if you can't pay, is the government going to still help you out? I know that we do have these programs which are still part of our model, but...
So in regards to how the government responds when people aren't able to pay, having such a pricing mechanism such as the tier system that the professor had mentioned earlier, having that sort of different tiers that people qualify for in regards to not just what they consume in water, but also it should be reflective of what they financially earn and their financial stability as well. So by having that sort of pricing mechanism, people are better able to pay prices that are reflective of what their current situation is, as well as with an increase in those tier pricing systems now, that will also increase people's recognition that water is a scarce source by having minor increases, but still having that tier division. Because by going completely to private water systems, the average household will pay 33% more per month for those private water systems.
And to answer your question about the access and how the water could go away, and it would be more likely to go away under a private system than a public system. If you look towards capitalism, basically the nature of it is if you can't pay for it, you can't have it. And we see in the status quo right now, 12% of the households that do get their water supply from a private company are paying on average 33% more comparatively than households that have public water services.
And I'm going to let you guys respond, but after that, I'm going to take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, then have them ready.
Right. So I want to settle this right now in terms of price, like fear-mongering in terms of price. I want it to be understood that the reason why private companies have this higher price is because of the fact that these private companies are investing. Like, let's look at a perfect example in which we've seen privatization successful. That is the country known as Britain, in which they had a 9% increase. But I want it to be clear that this 9% increase just doesn't happen because the company feels like having some money. It's instead happening because what we've seen is wasteful leaks fallen by 33%. You have 33% of your water bill now being saved because of the fact that investment was made. In addition to that, supply interruptions are down, water pressure is plummeted, and just a lot of other benefits. What we have to understand in this discussion today is that a corporation isn't going to drive up your water bill and screw you out of not having any sort of accessible drinking water.
Let's take some questions from the audience now. Let's see. Yes. Yeah.
So, I haven't learned about economics, but water is a pretty inelastic good because everyone needs it, right?
Okay.
So what prevents all the private companies from just driving up the water prices outrageously high?
This is for the affirmative side, correct?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great.
All right. So as our guest speaker brought up earlier, there's a lot of government regulation in terms of prices. Essentially, they'll just set a price ceiling. You can't cross a certain price. Let's say, I don't know, this is probably, I'm not an expert on exact pricing, but let's say you can't pay no more than 5 cents for a gallon of water. So essentially, because we see those kinds of regulations, not only in the water sector, but also other areas of our economy, it's kind of hard for a private water company to do this and essentially abuse you with prices just because of that.
Yeah, and especially with the fact that as more water is wasted, the scarcer of a resource it becomes, the companies would end up having, companies and the government especially, if the water continues being wasted, the prices would go up. So by the private companies being able to stop a lot of these water leaks and the water wastage, the prices won't be in crazily high as demand for water increases, because there won't need to be a demand, a greater demand.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So under a private system, they're not going to have the same duty to serve the people and the same obligation. And as well as private companies are going to have basically be able to back out. And there's nothing that is going to stop private companies from not serving anyone that they don't want to serve.
Let's get another question. Yes, Susan.
This is a question for the affirmative team. So a couple of times you used the example from Camden, New Jersey, of what I understand to have been mismanagement of water resources by a private company, and then the government came in and took care of that. So I want to understand, I mean, in that example, if the government had to step in Camden, isn't that then an example of how the government ultimately is a better regulator than a private company?
So ultimately, not necessarily, just because that was a specific case in which we're just showing there's oversight. There's oversight with anything we do in life or with any aspect of the economy. So essentially saying that because the government intervened in this one specific instance, if applying the logic that the government is the best regulator overall, then the government should essentially own every single business in America at that point. That's not a thing that happens in the United States because we are a capitalist economy. Ultimately, because if there's just abuse going on, the government steps in. But most of the time, on balance, we don't see abuse happening with management of private companies in the water sector.
Yeah, and
Okay, yeah, I mean, they essentially, private companies they don't really have the burden to serve the community. And
I would like to just quickly chime in. I mean, the reason why the government in this case would be a better regulator of people having a human right and just a right in general to water accessibility comes from also the international pressure that the U.S. as a country faces for being part of different sort of charter, for different part of international organizations such as the UN, and many of these international organizations put a lot of pressure on countries to ensure that their people have accessibility to water.
And the UN has recognized that water is a human right, and I understand your argument that if the government is the best regulator, the best provider of services and goods, then why doesn't the government own everything? I don't think that that's a model that we want in America, and that's not how we practice it here. And to commodify something that is such an essential good to life, that's a right that you need to survive, it takes on a lot of risks, giving the control of something that's so essential to life for us, just to give it in the hands of private interests who don't have the sincere obligation or the commitment to serving us long term, like you say, and they are profit driven, and that's why they do disenfranchise people who can't afford the higher rates.
Yeah, I just kind of want to clarify to you all kind of the fact that they're trying to make the government seem like these amazing public servants who are trying to just help the people, but that's not been the case historically. Everyone in government has their money, their hand in someone's pocket. Everybody's got the people that they owe money to. The government doesn't have to do anything, and frankly, if the government has all the water resources, who knows what could happen, you know? But with the government oversight, they're very good at regulating things, especially when it can make the government more money for itself. Because if there are fines for these companies, then these companies will, you know, be more incentivized to not screw up essentially and to break these like laws that we have. But they're trying to make the government seem like it's this all holy, almighty, amazing, pure thing, but it's not. As I've pointed out in so like the examples in Flint, Michigan, they did nothing, and Flint has been complaining for so long. The government has done nothing about it. They've allocated less money to infrastructure. They've ignored Flint. They ignored Tucson when the Tucson water crisis among the Mexican immigrants were happening. The government isn't this all-holy being, and the only person holding the government accountable is us and the government, and they've historically not listened to us. So
Let's get another question. Yeah, I saw this hand right back here. Yeah, I think it's you. Yeah, yes, you in the red, next to you. Yeah.
So this is a question for the affirmative.
Okay.
I'm going to take the same words you said and flip them around, because with Flint, Michigan, right, a lot of the water, fresh water there is being allocated to privatize companies like Nestle. They have a water source there. And this is a direct quote from the CEO that says, Tim Brown said, if he could bottle more of drought-stricken California's water for profit, he would. So how do you change that kind of culture? If the government for so long has been being mismanaged like that, aren't you at the same time like idolizing privatized companies in the same way?
So I think this goes to the analogy that you can't let one bad apple ruin the whole entire tree. There's always going to be that rotten apple out there that says something that makes you automatically no longer like that. Just because the Nestle CEO has that view of bottling water or drought-stricken California doesn't necessarily mean it correlates to the views of everyone else in the private sector. So I think that's important to understand, that we shouldn't necessarily see private companies as wanting to hurt all of their consumers, because at the end of the day, these consumers, these people that drink the private company's water, if those consumers don't drink their water anymore and they're not satisfied with their service, then they don't have any sort of company.
It's actually probably important to point out that the actual phrase is "one bad apple spoils the bunch," so it's actually quite the opposite. But go ahead if you want to. If you want to go ahead.
Well, I'd like to hear why you argue that that private companies are like, I'm sorry, that they're the best regulators of water, but that they're not the best people to distribute it, because isn't like a key component of regulation like foresight and prevention, and like in order to prevent things from water becoming contaminated or having shortages, shouldn't they, like, is that underfunded? Like, how can you justify that they're excellent regulators when we see issues with like pollutants in the water that, like, if there was proper prevention, it could have been avoided?
I think that kind of what I was trying to say was if there was more money being allocated to regulation, so with the government's no longer having to be in charge of the distribution of water, there would be more money for them to put towards the regulation of water. So then they would become more funded and they would be able to do a better job. They already do a pretty decent job with, I would say, with regulating water companies, but not with regulating itself and with the distribution of water.
Well, you're ultimately arguing for the private company to be the middleman to achieve the changes that we need, because you're saying that they're going to have more, the government's going to have more ability to invest in regulations and prevention, as well as more money to allocate to, you said water stamps, because they don't have the financial burden of actually providing the water. But essentially, isn't that just the government paying for the deficits that are inevitable through a middleman and just letting the private companies skim money off the top? If we need to allocate more money to improving these infrastructures, then we should do it through like the most efficient funding that we can receive and the most manpower, which is obviously going to be public, not through private interests and private companies.
So the reason why we brought up the water stamps is because of to show the idea that there is support out there in the event you can't afford your water bill. Even people like on public sector water, they often can't afford their water bill, so that's why there's water stamps in place. But Sam, I'd like to ask you guys a question, because at the start of Juan's speech, he brought up a point about like water scarcity and how what we've actually seen, to quote him, we've seen large public mismanagement happening. So if the government right now is in charge of managing water distribution, why did you guys say that there's large public mismanagement? Doesn't that just show that the government, that you agree that the government isn't good at managing water distribution to begin with?
I think that's showing that we agree that in the status quo, we're in a state where, you know, in the near future, we're going to have to make a lot of changes and pay more attention and allocate more funding through some way to our water infrastructure in the U.S. because just the status of, you know, the pipes that we have, they're different materials in different regions, but we're coming up on having to invest a huge amount of money. And I'll go into, in my closing statement, I spoke a bit about how Congress did realize the need for publicly owned water in 1972, and then under the Reagan administration in '86, he removed a program that gave state and local municipalities the ability to get funding to improve their infrastructure and have a cushion when there's fluctuation in demand. And then there was a 10-year gap until 1996, and the Safe Water Drinking Act gave that funding every year. The federal government allocates funding and then provides it to local water treatment and potable water services.
So I think we have time for one last question, a very, very quick one. If anybody has a question for the negative team, because we actually haven't had a question for them yet. Yes, you, sir.
This might be a weird one.
Great.
And if it's too weird, then you can kick me out. I like it weird. Someone else asks. I think this is a really intense conversation that we've been having tonight, and it's gotten pretty, it's gotten into philosophical, philosophy, it's gone into economics, it's gone into ethics, it's gone into resources, natural resources, obviously. And the weirdest thing, I think, was when we both came to a conclusion there were bad apples on both sides of the equation, right? There are people with their hands in pockets in the government. And so they're not looking out for us. They're representatives or their citizenry, whatever it is. And you guys said there are people like Nestle that also are bad apples. There's probably way more where that comes from. We all know that.
So the weird question is?
So the weird question is, let's say we completely scratch that prompt right there, okay, gone. And you can't do a private market for all your ideas and make all your money, sorry. And you guys can't, what if you never find enough advocacy and enough political power to make funding or take funding away from our insanely large military to get it and put it towards our water? Okay, never happened. What option would you pick there if it wasn't these two? What would you come up with? And I want to hear answers from both teams.
I mean, by dismantling this entire motion here and going into into just like a weird third option. I guess the best would be simply to just directly get people involved. I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, that comes in so many ways. That comes in just having, even just these discussions that we're having here, even having all you guys come out and come see us, actually listen and talk about this. Maybe this will lead to your own independent research to think about what you think is best. Actually changing the culture of seeing water as a right and not just as a consumer good that private companies will be incentivized to manipulate just to make more profits. And by changing that culture, by effectively having discussions like this and by simply getting more transparent information out there to the people, that itself will create a sort of change in order to combat the future problems that we'll be facing.
And let's get a quick response from the affirmative, and then we'll move on to our closing statements.
Yeah, I kind of have to agree with Juan here that the best way to kind of change our water systems is to get the word out that there's something wrong with it. Tell your local government that there's something wrong with your water systems. Email the companies that are taking over the water systems. On both sides, there's of course going to be bad apples, and there's no perfect system, as we've kind of told you as of tonight, that neither side is perfect, but by being able to tell you guys about it and to let you make up your own mind as to which side kind of is the better side and what we can kind of do to emulate a society in which maybe a conglomeration of the two exists that allow for the perfect system for all of us to be able to get our water, to conserve our water, and to have it be economically and environmentally sound. So I wanted to thank you guys for being here and for being interested in learning about this incredibly, as Juan said, dry topic.
Wonderful note to end the second round on. Thank you. We're going to now directly move into our final closing statements. They'll be very brief. They'll be 6 minutes each, after which you guys can vote on the winner, and then we will have our raffle, and you will be able to get your free gift card if that's the only reason why you came. So that said, closing down the affirmative side of the resolution that distribution of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government, we have Vincent Hassa.
Let me begin by just clearing the steam from this much heated debate and expose why the negative team's fear tactics aren't exactly believable or to be scared of to begin with. When Kayla and I sought to research out tonight's topic for the key evidence, understand why it truly matters, why we should be concerned of this, we were asking, should we bore you with an economics debate, an ethics debate, or give you the true meaning of what it means to have water rights and your water distributed to you? And ultimately, because there are many aspects to argue for this resolution, this debate boils down to the three main issues of economics, efficiency, and environment. These three E's in this debate and in this discussion in general are something that I'm going to fully explain right now in the next 5 minutes. First, let me begin with clarifying any confusion and pointing out the economic benefits of water privatization. In a comprehensive meta-analysis, while many studies show that private water will have slightly higher rates than public water, most of these studies fail to take into account the severe underinvestment water has. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. Water in the public sector is underpriced, but that's because there's no investment whatsoever right now. We need to start having investment, and we haven't seen the government take that step in the past few decades. Because as the Congressional Budget Office explained back in 2014, the federal contribution to the national water infrastructure spending has fallen from 63% of the total in the 1970s to just 9% in 2014. Due to a lack of federal investment in water infrastructure, we are starting to see our water systems fail beneath our feet, and this is directly impacting our communities because the underlying issue is that states can't afford it because, as a policy analysis shows in 2013, in many communities, these water bills in the public sector ultimately don't cover the cost of repair or upgrading old facilities. So it doesn't matter if your pipe bursts and you have a low water bill. That pipe is going to stay bursted, and the government is going to take a negative net loss because they simply don't have the money to repair it. And this is important to understand in how private sectors actually will help solve this issue. Because as a 2019 study from the Brookings Institution concluded, private companies adopt a more flexible, forward-thinking strategy in which private companies are able to solve issues such as information gaps, investment strategies, and have better financing tools to remain afloat. It's important to understand that private companies are not going to, in essence, drive up prices and hurt people out of getting water. Instead, they're developing better strategies in order to make sure your water bill either stays cheap or it will even get cheaper in the long term. Second, let me discuss how and why private water is more efficient than public water. Kayla and I didn't want to give you a theoretical value on what could happen over the long term. So I'm going to give you a real long-term world example of privatization working. In 1989, Britain privatized a large portion of its water system, and it's had outstanding results. Britain's water system is similar to the United States', in which water prices have been kept artificially low under government ownership, in which we've seen the underinvestment happening and inefficient overconsumption that happens in the United States right now. And as a comprehensive study over 20 years shows, what we've seen is that prices have only risen by 9%, but that's important to understand because it's in track with inflation. Wasteful leaks have fallen by 33%, supply interruptions are down, low water pressure has plummeted, and drinking water quality has increased, and pollution has fallen. The success of a private water company is highly dependent on efficiency, because as a 2009 policy overview explains, that having an efficient water system is ultimately the most important factor for a private water company. Any issues with the system can lead to overwhelming costs that the public sector experiences. Therefore, private companies in the long term are incentivized to upgrade and make their system more efficient, which is not only good for the company, but also for the consumer themselves. Finally, I want to discuss the topic of the environment, specifically with managing our water resources. The water industry right now needs to start shifting towards desalination to combat environmental effects such as drought. Although it's important to understand in today's discussion that only private companies can do this because of the extreme costs of desalination. As The Economist explained last month, 4 out of 5 desalination plants are privately owned in Israel because of the cost to build one. But here's where it turns to America, in which consumers are actually going to be benefited, because if we were to construct a private Huntington Beach seawater desalination plant, it has the ability to produce enough water for 400,000 people, which reduces the strain on North California and the Colorado River. And as more private companies are involved in the water distribution process, this technology and process becomes a lot more cheaper and becomes much more efficient for consumers. Kayla and I want to make it known in today's debate that we are not advocating for people to be cheated out of having access to water, because we all as students are directly affected by it. We're just simply advocating for a better system that makes water cheaper and more accessible for everyone in the long run. For the reasons of water economics, efficiency, and environment being better in the hands of privatization, Kayla and I are proud to affirm.
Thank you. And closing out both his side of the debate and the entire debate itself, on the negative side of the resolution that distribution of water resources should be transferred to private companies instead of the government, we have Sam Sheeter.
Okay, so I'd like to begin by reading a bit of a prepared statement that I have, and then I'm going to respond to some of the things that we discussed. So in a world where the balance of power and material resources is more often than not tipped in favor of the wealthy and corporate interests, and where a growing number of people lack access to life-sustaining water resources, it's no surprise that the conflict over water is on the rise. A scarce resource, the ownership of water, who manages, owns, and has access to clean drinking water, will be critical for the lives of billions and will ultimately impact us all. Many activists argue that water's the next oil and that the wars of the future will be fought over control and access to safe water. A matter of life and death, the politics of water, including the movements to mobilize and protect water as part of the commons, is one of the most critical, visible, and contested issues of our time. We, as thoughtful Americans, must not fail to realize the risks that are in play in this discussion. If our crucial infrastructures that provide water across the nation shifts to private ownership, we'll be giving away our capacity to influence and regulate their operations. Under a privately owned water distribution system, our ability to access safe water is left at the discretion of corporations. Private company administrators are motivated by satisfying their shareholders and maximizing profits. Think about the level of ethicality that we see from large corporations in the status quo. And if we look at the impact that privatization has on 12% of the US right now, as I mentioned during our crosstalk period, they're paying an average of 33% higher than a comparable household that has a public water service. This is directly the result of private companies who operate in their own interests. They don't have the same standards of transparency or civic duties, as we discussed, to serve us as its people. In the world of 100% privately owned water distributors, they will have too many players in the industry to operate at maximum efficiency. The utilities and facilities in our plants will be bought and sold just with profit in mind, and not actually looking towards the long run. Like I mentioned, private companies hire high-skilled workers and result in job loss whenever they come into a new place. They hire people that are well-off, that are well-educated, and they cut a lot of those low-skilled jobs. If taxpayers were to subsidize private companies, it would go straight into the pocket of private investors to add to their portfolio, instead of being invested back into public government-owned utilities that aim to serve their communities in the long term. And that kind of goes with what I mentioned about the middleman, is essentially if the government is still going to be the one providing all the funding through its money, through taxpayer dollars, to bridge the gaps that this private sector won't be able to take care of, it's essentially increasing overall costs, and it's less efficient than if we're doing it directly through the government. Private companies also often cut costs and use poor construction materials, as well as lower their customer service standards. So we didn't get much into the details of how private companies, or examples of how private companies have actually made improvements. But in the private companies that we have in the US, we haven't seen any major infrastructure improvements in comparison to public companies. So do you want it to become the responsibility of corporate America to ensure you and your family have access to safe water? According to a recent survey from the EPA, the U.S. must invest an additional $1 trillion for upgrades and maintenance on water infrastructure, as we've established. And as we mentioned, the reason for our current infrastructure needing a significant increase in funding is because we haven't consistently planned and allocated funds over time to prepare for kind of this peak that we're having, where we're having to replace so many of our pipes all throughout the country. So in order to actually achieve the improvements and replace the pipes that we need, these are the adjustments that will take place. We'll see public water services implement rate increases in households where it's socioeconomically appropriate. So essentially, it is apparent that under the current system, through public providers, there's not enough money to being saved and being allocated to improvements that we desperately need. And so this is an issue that we're about to be facing, and we have to be willing to spend more money if that's possible for us, or to advocate for it to be more known by the government. Local and state-run municipalities will receive more low-interest monetary aid through federal grants, as I kind of described earlier, enabling them to restructure the outdated facilities. Inevitably, we'll face a point in the near future where our voters and politicians realize that we have to allocate more money to fix this problem that we're facing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what Vincent said. He argued for desalination, But desalination is not actually a feasible source to provide water. It's extremely expensive. It's only used in the experimental stage. And one of the main issues of it is it produces large amounts of a toxic grime that it's not possible to dispose of right now safely. That hurts our marine life, and it's just so exorbitantly expensive. It's not used anywhere to actually provide water to people. It's basically something that's just being studied right now. So that's not a feasible solution. And I'd like to just kind of go over some of the benefits that he talked about. That's my time? Oh, okay. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Great. So a couple things. So first of all, hand in your votes right now. It'll take about a minute and a half to tally them, so stick around. Again, green, if you are in favor of this side, please pass over your green card. If you're in favor of this side, please pass over your pink card. And hopefully no one is undecided by this point, so you can pass that over if you're still unclear. That said, a couple of things I want to make sure that everyone is clear on. So first of all, just to reiterate, our future events that we have coming up, we have an event on April 9th where we're going to be discussing whether or not college should be accessible and free, especially community college. And later on in April, we're going to be discussing prison rights, rights for prisoners for college, and also whether or not for-profit prisons should be abandoned. We want to, if you are unclear or want to know where you can get more information on our events, please make sure that you go to our social media at UA Debates. Right after we tally all the votes, I have 2 gift cards right here that you, if you have your raffle, we're going to call out the tickets. Yeah, there we go. I want to say another thank you to Dr. Whitaker. Dr. Whitaker, do you have something you want to say?
I can just say something when you're done.
Yeah, sure.
Not swaying anyone.
Yeah, great. So very quickly, Dr. Whitaker has one last thing to say, but before she comes up, let's get one more round of applause for Dr. Whitaker for coming out.
I wanted to say I'm really impressed with both sides. You both made some really strong arguments, and so thank you for getting people interested. One of the things that was not talked about a whole lot, and so I'm going to put in a little pitch for my own class, is the science and the hydrology and where water resources are. Our aquifers they don't have boundaries, right, except for natural boundaries. So that complicates things. And in the state of Arizona, we don't recognize the physical reality of groundwater connected with surface water like streams. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the science on a very general education level, I teach a class called Arizona Water Issues. If you want to ask Jenny about it, you can. It's Hydrology 203, and that'll give you a little bit more information so that when stuff like this does come to be voted on as a proposition, you don't have to rely on me necessarily. You don't have to rely on passion or instinct. You can be a little bit more data-driven and scientifically informed about it.
Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. So I do also want to remind anybody who enjoyed what they saw up here and think that they might have the chops to do it too. We both have, again, the Regents Cup that's coming up in November. If anybody would be interested in competing against both ASU and NAU and just completely blowing them out of the water because we're obviously a better school, then make sure that you come up to me and I can give you some information and you can apply. And also we have, unfortunately, sadly, we have a few of our interns are graduating in just a month, so we're going to have a few slots. If anybody's interested in applying for our internship program, then you can absolutely do that. I want to also say an obvious thank you to all 4 of our debaters who did just a phenomenal, phenomenal job. All of our interns who aren't up here right now, but who helped put together research packets for this, helped to train our interns and helped to make sure that everybody's arguments were on point. And of course, again, our marketing team who were just amazing at the promotion. And if you have any suggestions about future topics, again, if you go onto our social media, you're more than welcome to suggest them. That said, I have the winners right here. I don't understand this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Before You want to write it on the board? Because I don't think I'm going to remember all this. Before the debate began, there were 4 votes for the resolution. There were 46 votes against the resolution. And 27 of you were undecided. Can you repeat this? Yeah, there were 4 votes for the resolution, 46 against, and 27 undecided. After, there were 29 votes for the resolution. That's a pickup of 25, in case anybody doesn't know math. Undecided, that there were 12 of you. And the against side ended up having 37, which is actually they went down by 9 points. So the winners of our debate tonight are the affirmative team in favor of privatization. So congratulations to our winners, congratulations to all 4 of our debaters, and congratulations to the person who's holding, well, the 2 people. We have ticket number 865064. 865064. Nice. Wait. And our second card goes to the person who's holding 865021. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. This was an absolutely excellent event. And come up and talk to our debaters if you want to yell at them and argue more.